Hello and welcome to the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. My name is Lewis Gray. I'm a senior marketing manager here at DSMN8, and I'm joined today by my co-host Elliot Elsley, who is our director of sales operations. Um, Elliot, how are you? I thought we'd just kick off with a quick catch up.
Yeah, doing well. Busy week, busy time of year, as it always is in the sales world, coming up to end of year and trying to get things done. But, well,
And we've both got shirts on today as well.
I know well, you've clearly taken the hint from me turning up with a shirt every week.
Yeah, I was going to say it sounds like a compliment or a dig from my side. You actually always wear a shirt. I'm pretty sure we've just been on 9 a.m. calls on a Tuesday, just on internal calls, and you've been wearing shirts.
Always.
So I think if I was to see you in a t-shirt, that would almost be more of a special occasion.
I've turned up to I think one work call in a t-shirt, and people asked if I was all right. So I can't do that anymore.
Ah, that's amazing. I think I'd get the same, to be honest, just for wearing a shirt to a casual one. Um, but yeah, to be perfectly honest, for anybody who might be watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify, either or. But yeah, I typically put a shirt on for special occasions. It's become a bit of a running joke on the podcast. But the reason I decided to put a shirt on today was actually for two reasons. One, I'm having my office slash podcast studio redecorated at the moment, and I've got a wall half covered in paint. And I thought, hey, a white backdrop isn't the most engaging. Elliot, you've got lovely plants and other bits and bobs. So I thought, let me add some color to this. And this is probably the most colorful thing I could pick out of my wardrobe. But then also, most importantly, like I said, it's for special occasions. I'm absolutely delighted to announce that we've just released the Employee Advocacy Benchmark Report. So, to give you a bit of backstory to this report, and now many of you that work in employee advocacy or who have just researched the topic in the past will know that a lot of the data that's most commonly cited, whether that's in reports or blog posts or whatever it might be, is actually quite outdated now. So, a lot of it is between 5 to sometimes up to 10 years old. And when you consider how much the social media landscape has changed, particularly in the last 5 years, a lot of it's really no longer fit for purpose. So, towards the start of the year, we decided to do something about it and we put a survey together. So, this survey went out to pretty much everybody in our contact database, whether that's our personal networks or our marketing nurture lists. And we wanted to hear from program managers, so people managing employee advocacy programs, and employee advocates too. And we wanted to kind of combine these insights and put together an up to date benchmark report for employee advocacy. So, we're going to be going through our key takeaways from this report today. But I just wanted to say right at the start that the link to grab a copy of the report is in the show notes wherever you're listening to or watching this. So, if you're on YouTube, just head to the description, Spotify, description, show notes, wherever it might be. But I'd encourage you to download a copy because we're going to be going through our key takeaways today. But there's all sorts of visualizations in there that just make this data come to life, I would say. So yeah, Elliot and I will be going through our personal key takeaways and just discussing a few of these because there's some really eye-opening ones. But with all of that said, let's get into the episode. Okay, so to kick the episode off, I guess the one I wanted to start with is one of the key takeaways that's actually identified on one of the first pages in the report. And that is that 32% of respondents to our survey said that they'd never received any formal training or a social media policy. Now, for me, that actually seemed a little bit lower than I thought it was going to be because it's something that we talk about quite often, whether that's on the podcast or with through our other channels. Is the fact that a lot of organizations will tell us they actually just don't have a social media policy in place. We've put together templates, we have hosted webinars on the subject. But I was expecting this to be a lot higher, to be honest. I thought more organizations weren't training their employees on how to use social media effectively and weren't providing social media policies. But for me, I think that just is testament to the reasons why we decided to put together this report, because clearly the data that we've been looking at wasn't quite up to scratch for 2024 when we're recording this. But I wanted to get your thoughts, Elliot. Is that a shock
Yeah.
to you?
Well, 32% having no social media training or policy, you spin that around, it means 68% do. So the majority do, which is a good thing. But I think it really depends on what somebody means by social media training, particularly in the scope of employee advocacy. To me, in my experience with launching clients, launching advocacy programs over the past sort of 6 years, there's two types of social media training in my eyes. There is competent social media training for your business and how to optimize your social media output. And that's in a more marketing sense, I guess, would be the way to look at that. I'm talking to employees about how they can maximize their personal brand, how they can really, really kind of dial in on social media and in turn assist the business as part of that. How can you talk about our business and our services in a more optimal way to get a better output? The other side of that is functionally how to use social media training, which is this is how you log into LinkedIn, this is how you upload a profile picture, and all of these different elements. That level of social media training just shouldn't be needed at a business. If somebody can't log into LinkedIn and things like that from an employee advocacy perspective, they're just probably not your target audience to be onboarding into an EA program. They're not necessarily the people that you want to immediately first onboard. Sure, later down the road, take that kind of process, but off the bat, that's a really, really important distinction to me. If you feel like a need to train people on social media as to how to physically post something, there's better ways to spend your resources and your energy, in my opinion.
Do you think? I mean, that's something that came to mind for me. To be honest with you, do you think that kind of ties in with being more strategic with who you invite? Is that what you're saying? Just kind of prioritizing the right people, putting all of your eggs in the right baskets, as opposed to just one.
Definitely. And I think it also comes back to, and something that we mentioned on the previous episode, but a lot of people will gatekeep their employee advocacy program. So you can't join a company's employee advocacy program unless you've completed the mandatory training. And at a lot of companies, that training is really quite archaic, it's quite old, it's very basic levels of this is how you use social media. And it's something that just most people know at this point. Social media's been around such a long time, everyone's familiar with it. So I think making sure that you don't need social media training for your employees to be active on social media is an important step. And for me, that 32% number is really actually great because it means, hey, we just trust people to get on with this and we don't have a formal process in place to train people. We're just happy for people to kind of get on with it. Now, I know that's not always the case at a lot of businesses, but in the scope of businesses that are running employee advocacy programs, that's a really, really good sign, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, do you think there's something to be said about the industry that they're working in? Because, of course, if we're talking, this comes from a conversation that you and I just had with Mikey Janssen quite recently, the employee advocacy leader at Dentsu Benelux. And she was saying that, when you're working with regulated organizations, social media training is something entirely different. It's less kind of what you've just explained, less how to, and best practices and more. These are the things you have to do. These aren't her words, but otherwise you might get in trouble. We might get in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the social media training that people need, right? Where people are reluctant to post on social media because they're unsure of what the best way or the correct approach is because of their business. But if you're a marketing agency and you're just talking about what's going on in the world of marketing, you shouldn't need guidelines and policy to define that. You should just be able to talk about it. Now, it's different if you're talking about clients and perhaps you're talking about competitive markets or, as you say, like pharmaceutical businesses, financial services. There might be some rules and some regulations that you need to just keep an eye on, but it shouldn't require an 8-hour seminar before you can post something onto LinkedIn for a business. That's slowing that whole process down. It's making it more restrictive. So that 32% number, You can see good in it, you can see bad in it, but to me, it's a positive sign that people don't feel like they need social media training to run an EA program.
Yeah, no, mate, that's super interesting, and something that you said a moment ago has kind of teed up my next key takeaway. And typically, I would want us to take this in turns, but I think because you've kind of segued onto it quite naturally, it's a good time to mention this one. So, one of the questions we asked in the survey was just around the challenges that employee advocacy leaders or program managers had encountered on their path to success or to launching a program. And 28% of respondents said that the number one issue for them was a resistance to using social media. So this is coming from employees just simply saying they didn't want to be posting on social media at all. And for me, that was actually quite surprising. But at the same time, I thought it was quite low. So, Elliot, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, with your background in the for anybody that hasn't watched the previous episode, Elliot is our former director of customer success as well. But I'm curious to know if that's something you used to encounter, and if so, I guess what were the um, not the obstacles? What's the opposite? Help me out here. The solution. I was trying to think of a clever metaphor for that, but what was the solution?
That was on the tip of your tongue. I could feel it. Right. Yeah, with that, I think resistance to using social media is that's not a surprise that that's the biggest challenge that people are facing. It's to me really always going to be the biggest challenge at any business because and the reason I say that is every other challenge, generally speaking, in the EA space, and just to kind of quote some elements of the report there, some of the other challenges that people faced were an uncertainty about what content to share, a lack of interest in company content, a lack of understanding of how to share content. Those are all far more solvable options in the world of EA. If you're uncertain about what to share, the solution from a business perspective is to say, well, here's the content we're going to provide to you that you can share. That's a really, really easy challenge to solve. It's a natural challenge to come up against. Employees just aren't sure, they don't know what they should or shouldn't be sharing. But you can fix that very, very quickly, be it with technology, be it with just a Slack channel. A resistance to using social media, to me, just highlights, similar to what we were just talking about, you need to be targeting the right people to onboard into your employee advocacy program. And something that we see time and time again is people become very hyper focused on trying to onboard a particular business unit, a particular subset that in their head they've chosen to be the employee advocates of the business. But it doesn't always work that way. You often need to address the hand raisers, address the people that are arguably low hanging fruit, the people that are already posting on social, that are already active. This is just another way to be able to help them. The people that are resistant to using social media are probably going to be resistant to using social media whether you provide them an employee advocacy program or not. I often used to talk about this with a lot of our clients when we'd be talking about onboarding, particularly with larger enterprise businesses where, let's say, they've got 10,000 employees and they're trying to work out who to onboard, how to scale, how to grow their program. The way I often look at a business when it comes to social media and employee advocacy is as a range. Right at the top of that range, you've got the advocates that don't need an EA program, don't need any help. They're already posting on LinkedIn. They've got an amazing personal brand that they've developed themselves. They're really, really good at it. An EA program maybe helps them track and attribute it and just get a bit more visibility internally, but it's not a need for them. At the bottom end of that range, you've got the 5% of employees that wouldn't know their LinkedIn password if you put a gun to their head. They have no idea. They have no idea what it is, don't want to use it, have zero interest in it. Those people are going to be really, really hard to convert into employee advocates. You've got so many more steps to do to achieve that. So, particularly when you're first launching, embarking on this entire thing, everybody in the middle is who you want to be talking to. The people that are unsure about where to find content, the people that don't have the time to do it, which is why they don't post onto social. That's really easy. Let's make it simple. Let's make it concise. If you're using technology, let's automate the process, whatever it might be. You're addressing all of those people that are on their digital journey in some way, shape, or form. The people that haven't, set foot off that step yet, they're not necessarily worth onboarding and trying to convert straight off the bat because you're just going to be running at a brick wall. Whereas if you get everybody else on board, they might start to see the light and start to see why they should be doing it, and then they're much easier to onboard at that point. It's a natural bias that people will have. They try and target the people that they want in the program, not necessarily the people that should be in the program and that would want to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think part of the reason it surprised me personally is because, part of being a good marketer has been market oriented. And I certainly haven't been that with this next point. But for me, I always struggle to understand the resistance to using social media. But that's because my day to day, I'm predominantly in contact with other marketers, salespeople, or sales leaders, and then HR and employer branding professionals, all of whom put a significant emphasis on social media. But with that, I guess I don't want to lead the witness here with an answer, and I'm sure you wouldn't be led in that way anyway. But who would be, if we're talking departments, the best department or group of employees to start with?
Sure. I think you can probably bucket that into a few different pillars. The simple way to look at it, and this differs per business, some businesses don't have a sales team essentially. Obviously, a sales team is a very important group of people that you want to try and onboard. They have an interest in employee advocacy because there's value to them immediately. And that's the simple way to look at it. Who has a vested interest in the business having more visibility? Now, obviously, all employees do, but if I'm a developer, my compensation isn't tied to the value of the business necessarily. If I work in sales, my compensation is tied to how much revenue I bring in. So those are really kind of immediate people that I tend to look at. Senior leadership, sales teams, those people have a reason to be talking about the business publicly online. Like it's in their interest to do so. The same principle then applies for marketing teams. Marketing teams have an interest in their content getting more visibility. That's what marketing teams are all about. HR, talent attraction, same real principle. We're trying to hire more people. We're trying to hire the best people. Those four areas, the way I've just described that as senior leadership, sales, marketing, HR, and talent, they're the kind of core pillars. And then from there, big businesses, 10,000, 20,000 people, there's obviously wealths of teams and parts of that that are going to be interested. But those four pillars are a really, really good starting point. And then just think about who has an interest in this business, who has a vested interest in its success. And those are the people that will typically onboard much quicker. The people that are going to be harder to onboard are the people that have less of a vested interest in the success of the business. And this is dependent on industry and dependent on business, but that will be pretty naturally known. And we've got, I think, some resources online as well about personas and advocate personas that if people are kind of unsure, there's some really nice workflows to kind of go through there if you want to kind of break this down a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll link to those in the comments as well if anybody wants to check those out. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. We've seen it time and time again. If you start with the right people, these anecdotal stories of success come about, whether that's a salesperson generating a lead from social or whatever it might be. Sure enough, it snowballs. But Elliot, I've obviously rattled off two of my takeaways. I said this was a back and forth of each of our takeaways. So I'll hand over to you, mate. What's one of your top takeaways from the report?
I think one of my really big takeaways was seeing that 72% of the respondents are using some form of technology for their employee advocacy program. That's obviously, from my perspective, great. I'm in a sales perspective and with a sales bias. That's always a good news as an employee advocacy technology provider. But also, I've been with Disseminate for about 6.5 years. So I've seen employee advocacy when it was a more burgeoning concept. It was newer to people. They weren't really sure what it even was compared to today, where People are really seeing this a lot more as a must have across most businesses. So to me, seeing 72% of respondents using technology, if I could have done this survey 5 years ago, which would have been much more challenging because there were less people even running an EA program, but that response would have been 20, 30% at best, I suspect, of people using technology. So that's just a really big takeaway for me that so many more people are starting to turn to technology for this. And you'll have seen this, Lewis, you'll have experienced this most likely as well. But in talking to a lot of our clients, a lot of people used to do this manually. They send an email out with a load of content in it and send it to everybody in the business, and it's clunky and it's hard to do and it takes time, or they use a Slack channel to do it, but people don't really pay attention. Having dedicated tech that really manages this process, I think just makes such a big difference for so many people that I'm just pleased to see more people turning to a better solution for this, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, to be honest with you. I mean, I remember the days, I mean, you were here at DSMN8, I guess, a year, maybe 2 years before I was. And, I'm in year six now, I think. And I think back to 2019 when I joined, the idea was just like, not unheard of, but it was so niche. It was just like we were the almost like the mouthpiece for employee advocacy, just trying to put the word out there about it. And it's like, and there's technology out there, and we provide that technology, but it was we were doing two jobs. So it was certainly a relief from that standpoint. But when I saw that stat, firstly, I love that one. And when I saw it, I made a bit of an assumption, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. But I thought, okay, perhaps the what is it 28% of respondents who aren't using technology are smaller organizations, because I can't fathom a enterprise size organization, for example, successfully managing a large employee advocacy program manually, because it becomes so tricky for so many reasons. But does that kind of ring true to you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you run our advocacy program internally, right? We're not the biggest business in the world. We're sub 100 employees, let's go with, but I can't imagine you would want to run our advocacy program manually if knowing what you know now, if we took our own tooling away from you, it would be painful to do. And if you imagine that at a business of 5,000 people, where we've got six different countries involved, all speaking different languages, we've got three different business units that all sell completely different services or products, trying to just send an email out to the right people to say, hey, here's some content we think you should talk about. That's a 4-day task in itself to work out who those people are, to get sign off to send an email to that many people, because a lot of businesses have restrictions on these sort of things. It just becomes completely untenable to manage. And doing it with tech, obviously, you have all that segmentation built in, you have all of these kind of dynamic groups and lists and ways that you can manage all of this, but also you can just attribute it all. That's the other thing I think for a lot of big businesses. Once you start to build some traction with EA, once you've got X number of people sharing content on a regular basis, you want to know what the impact is. And you can't know the impact very easily without some technology in the background helping you track and attribute it. And you can see it, you can feel it, you get the general sentiment if lots of employees are sharing, but without hardline analytics, it's an improvable thing essentially.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think there's a couple of things that come to mind based on a number of the things you've just mentioned. But I think when we talk about the size of the business and how that kind of relates to whether or not they use technology, a really great example of this is a case study that we produced recently with Swiss Post. They're just a fantastic example of a complex business who set up an equally complex employee advocacy program, but they basically mirrored the structure of the business to effectively segment their employees and to group their content to ensure that every employee, no matter their department, their geography or their preferred language, they received content that was relevant to them and in their preferred language as well, which meant that they were more inclined to engage with it and share it. But I mention this just because that's something that's so unbelievably difficult to do without technology. And Elliot, I know you've probably had this conversation with a number of organizations who are just like, don't worry, we're doing this manually. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's what you run into so many times. Swiss Post is a great example of that, where they have a complex structure, they have all of these different languages, they have all of these different things. A way we used to describe it in a very simple way from a CS perspective was the right content to the right people, not the wrong content to the wrong people. Because you don't want to post your company news that say a latest product release or something along those lines and just send it out to the entire business on a kind of one to many scale, because it just might not be relevant to some people. You need to break this down, you need to segment it. But the bigger part of that with technology is giving employees the opportunity to choose the content that they are interested in. And that is another side of the whole thing with technology that enables employees to be able to pick and choose the topics that they're interested in, the content that they want to see, not just the content that a program leader or a marketing manager wants to provide you. Because as EA gets bigger, everybody wants to provide you content, because if you're a marketing manager, and Lewis, as an example, if you've just written a recent blog, you're not going to complain if 5,000 people at the company share it and get it loads of traction online. So you start actually vying for interest more than anything else. And you want to avoid that. You want to make sure employees can subscribe to what is relevant to them and what's interesting to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, the other thing I just wanted to call back to as well, because I think this is another, I don't know, it's a nice anecdote as to why technology becomes essential. Just recently, you and I produced a podcast episode, and I was actually uploading it to our platform for everybody to share. And something I was able to do was just exclude you from the list of people who were able to share it, which meant that you weren't referring to yourself in the third person when I was saying, and my co-host Elliot Elsley, it just meant that I could, prevent you from doing that. And it's just all of these things that you don't really consider until something bad happens or until you make these mistakes. But with the technology in place, it just prompts you to think about things like this. But Elliot, I think we've got a couple more minutes, and there's so many stats that we could cover here. I might have to shave my list down and exclude two of these, but um, back over to you, mate. What was another one of your key takeaways?
I think another one of my key takeaways was surrounding and going back to talking about tracking and analytics for this, is that interestingly, 61% of the respondents don't currently track the cost per click of their employee advocacy program. And that's interesting for two reasons. One, it's possible that people aren't utilizing technology or the right technology to be able to do that, which is one question in itself. But the second, and the sort of more inferred answer from this, is that it's not the most important thing. So when we first started as a business, that was a really big directive of employee advocacy. It was the ROI that you could drive off the back of this. And that was how realistically we had to sell it, because people weren't really sure of the benefits of employee advocacy. They weren't sure of why it was a good thing for their employees to post on social. What they were sure about is paid ads are really, really expensive, and this is a much cheaper alternative to be able to achieve a similar result. The fact that there's actually more of a shift now to people not tracking it because it's not as important to them, that's something that we see with a lot of our clients and a lot of our prospects. They see the value of the cheaper sort of traffic that they can drive, but actually the value to them is really to the brand, really to the brand visibility, to the thought leadership, to the expertise that they can demonstrate, to the hiring that they can get off the back of it by really kind of opening themselves up as a business. It's really interesting to see that swing. And again, if I could ask that same question 5 years ago, I suspect the answer would have been 70-80% are tracking the cost per click, because that was the only metric they had in mind. Now, the other side of it, as you've probably seen this, and maybe you have an opinion, is the majority of people that are tracking cost per click are seeing clicks of less than 25 cents, which you're experienced in the marketing world, you've dabbled in the paid ads world, I'm sure, as well. you know, that's a cheap exercise, if I'm not mistaken.
Unbelievably cheap by today's standards.
I think the average I know, and maybe you might be wrong, I see about $6 per click as kind of a LinkedIn cost per click that gets banded around.
Sometimes north of that, to be honest, you could go anywhere from 6 to 12. I've seen
Wow.
and heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is a cheap exercise for those people, and I think this splits a lot of marketing teams. You straddle both worlds of this, I think, in my opinion. But digital marketing, digital marketers that are focused on web traffic, they're focused on conversion funnels. They're a SaaS business. They want to make sure that every step of that journey is optimized until somebody presses the book a demo or the free trial button. You've then got the other side of marketing, which is the kind of brand advocates, the brand marketing, which is a little bit more about visibility, about brand awareness, about engagement metrics as an overall. So it does split the pile a little bit, and that's interesting because it's kind of reflected in the report. But to me, that was such an interesting metric to know that actually not everybody ties this directly back to ROI anymore. They tie it to different impacts within the business.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating for me to see as well because, I think again, 4 or 5 years ago, when this was maybe a little bit more niche, any content that we were putting out when we were trying to kind of communicate the value of employee advocacy was very much around the low cost per click. Maybe we would talk about earned media value. But generally speaking, most of the conversations I have now, especially when we're producing case studies or we have guests on the podcast, when I ask them how they're measuring the impact of their programs, firstly, there will be a couple of ways that they're doing it, but ultimately it's goal dependent. I've found, it could be if it's a performance marketer, maybe they are looking at the cost per click. If it's a employer brand manager, they'll be looking at different metrics entirely. But I had a really interesting conversation the other day that I can't speak about just yet because it's not a piece of content we've produced. But I was speaking with somebody running a program, and I asked them, "How are you? Or sorry, do you measure the cost per click?" And he was like, "Absolutely not." It's like, I don't care. It's like, respectfully, to me, I just don't care. And this is a very, very senior marketer within quite a large organization. But his logic was basically that he has seen and heard anecdotal stories. So long as he keeps hearing about these wins, and for as long as people keep self-attributing on forums and saying, "We heard about you on LinkedIn," or "one of your employees," or whatever it might be, he knew the potential impact of employee advocacy. He could see within the analytics of the tool that he was using. Um, I can tell you enough to say that it's DSMN8. But within the analytics suite, he could see the impact. He could see he was generating lots of comments, but he just didn't care about the cost per click, and that's because ultimately their goal was just brand awareness. If
Yeah.
people are talking about us within the industry, that's great.
Yeah, and a lot of the time that is, half the battle, right? If you know you're being seen, it's the same reason people buy billboards, right? People
Mm.
don't buy stuff directly after seeing a billboard. They see a billboard and they remember the brand and they remember, oh, they said something about something and whatever it might be on that billboard, and that impacts somebody further down the road. That's marketing in a nutshell. Just doing it with your employees and having them post onto LinkedIn regularly is probably cheaper than having a billboard, to be perfectly honest, depending on where it is. So it's a really, really useful kind of thought process for people to be able to have that they understand that this is a brand awareness technique and a brand visibility. They know the impact is good because they can see the sentiment of that impact across social.
And I mean, I don't mind saying either. When I jump into our analytics and do like a monthly review, I probably care just as much about comments generated on LinkedIn specifically because that's where our key audiences are. But I know that that means people are starting conversations because of the content that we're asking them to share or that we're providing them to share. And that for me is just as much of a positive indicator as it is, that they jump onto our website. Because if one of our salespeople is able to start a conversation with a prospect they've been speaking to, who maybe isn't replying to their emails, that's a huge win. And they'll tell me
That's
about it. That's everything I need to know. That's working.
for sure. Couldn't agree more.
Amazing. So, Elliot, I think we've covered plenty of stats from this report. And for everybody listening, if you haven't yet got a copy of the report, I'd highly encourage you to jump into the description, go into the show notes, get a report for yourself, because there's stats like this and so many more. And we've tried to make it as easy to digest as possible. We're not really fans of 100-page reports that are novel length. We were trying to produce something that was easy to digest and something you could refer back to and make sure you're on the right track with your employee advocacy program, or just to get some insights. So again, the link is in the description. But thank you, Elliot, for your time today. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We will catch you in a few weeks' time.